that the world is changing rapidly is an understatement. Change is just the reality that we have to deal with in today's world. As managers, we have to understand, first of all, what change is, and then we have to understand how to implement it successfully in our organizations. Because change unsuccessfully implemented in an organization can literally tear that organization apart. We're going to take a look at how to manage change in OSET chapters. So all of our examples will relate back to OSET. However, remember as we go through this session that these principles that we talk about, they are applicable to any type of organization. We'll start the session with a brief discussion about why it's important for us as managers to understand what change is and how to manage change in our organizations. Then we'll take a look at different types of change, or the categories that we can put change into. We'll take a look at the stages that an organization goes through as the change unfolds. We'll have a discussion on resistance to change. So what to do when there are people in our organization that are kind of pushing against the change that we're trying to put into place. Then we'll look at the steps that we want to go through to actually implement change in our organization. Finally, we'll have a discussion on change agents, and these are the people within our organization that we want to identify to help us put our change into place. Let's get started. I like to start all discussion of change with a great quote from Machiavelli. Here's the quote: "There's nothing more difficult to take in hand than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things." This quote captures just how difficult change is. We might have this great idea that we want to put into place in our organization, but actually making it happen, that's where the challenge lies. It's not the ideas that are the problem, it's the implementation of those ideas. And this is what change is all about. As we work through the rest of this session, hopefully you'll start to understand, first of all, how complex change is, and also the very human reactions that we get when we try to put change into place in our organizations. And this is why it's important as managers to understand change. It's extremely complex. It hits us frequently, where it's coming at us from all angles these days. And human beings react very differently to change. And it's managing those reactions that present the real challenges for managers. So once we get our heads around what change is and its complexity and how people respond to it, only then can we start to manage change effectively in our organizations. There are 6 types of change that we need to understand if we're going to implement and manage change in our organization. These change types are strategic, technological, product or service, structural, personnel changes, and finally attitudinal or behavioral changes. We'll start by taking a look at strategic change. Strategy is all about how we're going to make something happen. So a strategic change is a change in plan that we're going to put into place in order to achieve our goals or objectives as an organization. So taking OSET chapters as an example, each OSET chapter might have a strategy in place in order to fulfill its goals as a chapter. A strategic change would then be completely changing what that strategy is and how those goals are going to be met. So a strategic plan could involve a change in staffing or a change in marketing or a change in communication, but the strategy is all about how those pieces go together. So how is that organization going to get where it wants to go? The next type of change is one we're all familiar with these days: technological change. Technological change is coming at us from all angles, and it's impacting every aspect of every organization, including OSET chapters. There are 3 types of technological change, so we can divide this category into 3 subcategories. The first type of technological change is when we add a new technology to do something that we previously did manually. So we previously did something by hand, and now we're using a technology to do it instead. The second type of technological change is we're actually replacing an existing technology. So we might have a technology in place, but we're going to put a new technology in instead. So this could be something as simple as changing the operating system, upgrading from Windows 7 to Windows 8, for example. The third type of technological change is using technology to do something completely new. So there might be something that the organization has never done, and so they're going to bring in a new technology in order to accomplish that new thing. Product or service change is changing what you offer your membership or your customers or your consumers. So using the OSET example, OSET chapters offer membership support to OSET members. And so some of the services that are offered here include professional development, career assistance and career support, networking, and social events. So maybe a chapter decides to change one of these products or services or add a new one into the mix. So this is a product or service change. A structural change is changing how the organization is actually put together. So using an OSET chapter as an example, the organization might decide to change the reporting system or the types of roles and responsibilities people have and who does what. So structural change is reorganizing who does what in your organization. A personnel change is simply a change in the people who do things in the organization or the staffing. Using OSET chapters as an example, personnel changes could involve new volunteers coming in and taking responsibility, or it could involve existing volunteers moving outside of the volunteer role and just being involved as regular members. So these are personnel changes, changing the people involved in running the organization. The final type of change is an attitudinal and behavior change. So in this type of change, the people in the organization change how they think and how they act or behave. So we can kind of divide this into three types of changes or subcategories. We've got attitudinal changes, behavior changes, and then values changes. And this is the toughest type of change to implement in an organization, just to warn you. Identifying the type of change that you need to put into place in your organization or that you actually have happening in your organization is really important because this allows you to identify problems either existing or possible. And there's three main categories of problems that you want to look for as you're identifying your types of change. The first problem is that you might actually have more than one type of change going on. So you might, for example, have a technological change and you need also an attitudinal and behavioral change. Or you might have a structural change that is then resulting in personnel changes. So look for the possibility that there's more than one type of change going on. The second problem to watch out for is you may actually have a different type of change than the one you think you have. So for example, you may think you have a technological change. So you're trying to put this new piece of technology in and it's not working and you're getting all sorts of resistance. But in fact, you might actually have a behavioral change instead. It's not the technology that's the problem, it's people's attitudes and behaviors towards that technology that is the problem. So that's the second thing to watch out for. Do you actually have the type of change going on that you think you have? And the third problem to watch out for is one I've already mentioned, and this is attitudinal and behavioral change. Attitudinal and behavioral change is really, really challenging. This is where most of the problems with change implementation come from. So when you're putting change into place in your organization, keep your radar up for that attitudinal and behavioral change and pay close attention to it. Watch out for it, because if your change is going to get disrupted or derailed, it's probably coming from that change type. Change is a really hot topic right now with academics who focus on business. And academics are finding a lot of different ways to categorize or classify the different stages of change. And there's one classification system that I really like. And I like it because, first of all, it's very simple and clear. And second of all, it helps us once again identify where the challenges might arise as we implement change in our organization. So this change categorization system for the stages of change is really simple. It has 3 stages. The first stage is the unfreeze stage. The middle stage is the change stage. And then the final stage is the refreeze stage. So let's take a look at each of these 3 stages of change. At the first stage of change, the unfreeze stage, we want to accomplish a few different things. The first thing we want to do is define the change. So what is it that we actually want to accomplish, or what do we want to change in our organization? The second thing we want to do is prepare for the change. So we want to get ourselves prepared, we want to get the other people we're working with prepared, we want to make sure we have all the materials and the resources and everything we need to put this change into place. The third thing we want to do at this stage is to make sure everyone understands why this change needs to happen. So this is where we get buy-in. The more buy-in we have from all the people involved in the change, the more smoothly the change will go. And closely related to this, we want to minimize resistance to change. So we want to do the emotional work so that people are not going to put up emotional barriers to the change that we want to put into place. So a lot of really important stuff happens at this unfreeze stage of change. The second stage of change is the really obvious one, and this is the change stage. So this is where we implement the plan or the changes that we want to make happen in our organization. The final stage of change is the refreeze stage, and this one's really important as well. At this stage, we want to first of all stabilize the changes that we've put into place. We want to make sure that they're going to stick and that they're not going to just disappear overnight when we stop paying attention to them. The second thing is that we want to reinforce those changes. Make sure they're even stronger than we had initially planned. So make sure they are going to stick around. The next thing that we want to do is evaluate the change and the change process. So we want to look back and make sure and talk about how did things happen, did we get the outcomes we were looking for, and maybe how can we do it differently in the next time we do this type of change. And the final thing we want to do here is we want to tweak our changes. So we want to make small adjustments here and there to make sure that we've got the perfect change in place that's as good as it can possibly be. Using this framework with the 3 stages of change, the unfreeze, the change, and the refreeze, really helps us identify where the key challenges are with the change process. And so here are the 2 key challenges or problems that arise when change is implemented. The first one is that managers don't unfreeze, so they just jump right to the change process. And they expect everyone to be on board, they expect everything to go smoothly. So if we skip that unfreeze stage, we haven't laid any groundwork, and our change is just not going to succeed. So that's one of the problems that managers run into. They forget to unfreeze their organization. The second big problem that managers encounter with the stages of change or with implementing change is they forget to refreeze. So the first one is they forget to unfreeze, but then they correspondingly forget to refreeze. If we don't refreeze our organization and make sure that change sticks, the change is just going to destabilize and it can literally disappear overnight. And all our hard work will have been for nothing. Or if we don't refreeze and just give people the chance to emotionally calm down and get used to the change and just become comfortable, we can have staff members or people we're working with who are kind of on edge and just uncomfortable with the change. So that's the second main issue to watch out for. Make sure that you take the opportunity to refreeze your change. Not everyone wants our change to succeed. So we may, as a manager, be really into this idea that we're putting into place. We think it's the greatest thing and it's going to be amazing for our organization. But not everyone thinks the same way. We get what's called resistance to change. And resistance to change can happen both at the individual level, but it can also happen within an entire organization. So resistance to change is an emotional reaction to this change that you're trying to put into place. And it's the most powerful force that is there when it comes to change. If you don't manage and overcome resistance to change, your change just isn't going to work. Let's take a look at the individual barriers to change. So why do individuals resist change? There's quite a few reasons. The first one is fear. People are simply afraid of the unknown. They're afraid of something that's different. So their fear may be saying, hey, I don't want this change to happen. They may also be afraid of losing social relationships that exist in the current organizational structure. So they don't want to lose the bonds of those social relationships, so they say no thanks to the change. They may also be afraid of losing power. If the existing organizational structure, for example, gives them power, the change might take some of that power away, and they don't like that. Another reason that individuals resist change is simply inertia. They're comfortable, they don't want things to change, they like it just the way things are. Thank you very much. And finally, people might simply not understand why the change is needed. So you might not have gotten buy-in, and so people aren't pumped up about this change. They're not excited about it. They don't think it's important. So these are individual barriers to change, or this is where the individual resistance comes from. To help individuals in our organization overcome resistance to change, we can think about this change process at the individual level as a 4-step process. And every individual has to go through each of these 4 steps. Some individuals might go through faster and some might go through slower, but every human being reacts to change the same way and has to get to the same place and go through the same steps. So what are these steps? The first one is denial. They're like in shock and grief. They don't want this change. It's not necessary. They're like, no thanks, don't need this. The second one is anger or resistance. They're like, nope, not happening. They're frustrated, they're angry, they don't want to hear anything about the change. This barrier is really high and they're hiding behind it. The third one is exploration. They're like, maybe this change isn't so bad. Maybe I can get used to it. Maybe this might even be good. So they start to explore the idea of the change and they start to figure out, maybe this is something that I can buy into. Then the final step that they need to get to is where they're committed to the change. They're like, yep, you know what, this is cool, this is good, I'm into this. So I agree with this change, I'm going to participate fully. So every person goes through these steps, but they go through them at different speeds or different paces. So watch out for this as you're helping people overcome their barriers to change. We also see barriers to change or resistance to change at the organizational level. So in OSET, for example, there might be resistance to change within a whole chapter. Everyone in the chapter says, nope, not doing this. So what are some of the reasons for this organizational resistance to change? The first one can simply be organizational inertia. Everyone in the organization is comfortable, they like the way things are, they don't think we need to change. We're just comfortable, leave us alone. We can also have inertia at the departmental level. So if there are working groups within an OSET chapter, for example, one particular group that's important to the change process might say, no, not interested. The change might also be a threat to the balance of power. So people, or the organization, might resist the change because it will create this imbalance of power or this instability, and the organization just doesn't want to go there. Then the final resistance to change at the organizational level is that that organization might have a history of unsuccessful change. So for example, an OSET chapter might have at some point tried to implement a change and it didn't work. And so they're like, no, we can't handle change, we're no good at it, we're just not going to change because we won't be successful. So these are reasons that organizations might resist change. We've talked about the stages of change already, so unfreeze, change, and refreeze. We can also look at the stages of implementing change, and so this digs down into the change process in a little bit more detail. So this is an equally useful framework to use when we're approaching change in our organization. So we're going to take a look at a 12-step change implementation process. We'll take a look at each step in detail and what you need to do at each of these steps in order to arrive at the end point where you've got successful change in your organization. Step 1 involves defining your current situation. So where are you at as an organization now? So what's working in your organization, and most also important, what's not working. So where are you at right now? The next step to implementing change is to define for yourselves and for your organization, what does the future look like? So what are you targeting with your change? So there's two main questions you want to ask here. First of all, what does the future look like, or the preferred future? So what's your target? And equally important, why is this particular preferred future the one you're going after? So why do you want to go after this change? The third step of the implementation process is to define the change that's needed to get your organization from where it is now to where you want it to be in the future. So to talk in formulaic terms, what's the delta that needs to happen to go from here over to here? Step number 4 of the implementation process is to identify the resources that you need in order to make that change. So for your organization to go from here to here, what do you actually need in order to make that happen? So you need to think about people resources, financial resources, and technical or technological resources. What do you need to get where you want to go? Step number 5 of the implementation process is to do an evaluation. Does your organization actually have these resources that it needs in order to put this change into place? So do you have the people you need? Do you have the finances you need? Do you have the technology or the technical expertise that you need? And if you don't have this, how can you get it? So do you have what you need in order to put this change into place? Step number 6 is to ask the question, what might hinder the changes that you want to put into place? So what are the barriers to change that exist within your organization? Are the people in your organization ready for change? And is your organization itself ready for change? What might get in the way of you getting this change to be successful? Step number 7 of the implementation process is to create a step-by-step plan for the implementation of your change. So what are the steps that your organization needs to go through? What order should those steps go in? And then how long will each step take? Step number 8 of the change implementation process is to assign roles and responsibilities. So this asks and answers the question, who is going to do what? Step number 9 is all about communicating your change. And this is a step that very often gets overlooked as people or organizations are implementing change. So you need to tell everyone who's even remotely involved in the change process what this change is, how it's going to unfold, and why it's necessary. So this communication needs to happen internally within your organization, and then it also needs to happen externally with any external stakeholders that might be interested or involved in the change process. So don't forget your communication step. Step number 10 is to implement the change. You're going to follow your step-by-step plan and put this change into place. Step number 11 is to evaluate the change and the change process. So was your change successful? Was your change process successful? And why or why not? The last step of the change implementation process often gets forgotten. And this is the step where you celebrate. You take the time to acknowledge all of the individuals and all the departments and everyone who contributed to the successful implementation of this change. So take some time to celebrate. This 12-step model for change implementation is really useful once again for identifying problems and issues that unfold as the change process is going on. So if you run into a problem with your change process, take a look at each of these 12 steps. First of all, make sure that the step was completed, and second of all, use the questions within that step to make sure that everything that needed to be done at that step was actually done. So this 12-step process really helps you identify issues that you might run into or that you do run into as you're implementing change. It's also a very useful planning tool. If you follow these 12 steps for change implementation, your change will be successful. The last thing we'll talk about when it comes to putting change into place in your organization and within OSAT is the concept of change agents. Change agents are individuals who are very quick to buy into change, and they're very enthusiastic and they've got lots of energy. And what we want to do when we're implementing change is, first of all, we want to identify our change agents. Then we want to use them throughout the change implementation process so that they can help us drive that change. We're never going to get the change in place on our own, so we have to bring our change agents into the mix so that we can be successful. So who are our change agents? Who's going to help us put this change into place and help us make it successful? There are certain characteristics that you want to look for in individuals, and when you see these characteristics, you can say, yep, that's my change agent. First of all, you want someone who's flexible. And then you want someone who's objective, so they're not going to get caught up in the whole emotion that goes along with change. You want someone who's committed and energetic. It takes a lot of energy to drive change. You want someone who's innovative and creative. Very importantly, you want someone who's able to handle uncertainty because change is very, very uncertain, and you need someone who's comfortable with that. You need someone who understands your organization because change has to work for your organization. What worked in another organization might not work for you. Equally, you need someone who's passionate about your organization. They have to care that this change is going to be successful because the change will make the organization successful. You need someone who understands context, so they need to understand the environment in which your organization is functioning. They need to have leadership abilities because they're going to be at the front of change and driving the change. And finally, they need to have a sense of humor because a sense of humor can lighten up all the stress that goes along with change. You might not find all of these characteristics in one individual, but if you find the majority of them in an individual, that individual is probably a good change agent for you to bring on board. Remember, you can't make change happen on your own, so identify your change agents and let them help you out. We've looked at different frameworks that you can use to understand change and also to understand how to put change into place, either in your OSET chapter, in OSET as a whole, or in any organization for that matter. So we've looked at the types of change. We've looked at the 3 stages of change: unfreeze, change, and freeze. We've looked at individual and organizational resistance to change. We've looked at that 12-step implementation process. And finally, we've looked at how to identify change agents or the people who will help you put change into place. So the next time that you have responsibility for putting change into place in an organization, go back to these frameworks, take a look at them, understand them, and use them to help you be successful with your change implementation. The last thing we've given you on your handout is a list of useful resources. There is a lot of research being done on this whole concept of change, and this research is really interesting and also very helpful. So if you want to dig into the idea of change and how to make change successful in your organization, take a look at these resources. Remember how we started this session? We had a very brief discussion about why it's important to understand change and understand how to implement change. And remember that quote from Machiavelli? There is nothing more difficult to take in hand than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Remember, change is difficult. Never underestimate that level of difficulty and use those frameworks and those resources to help you be successful.